The airport, goodbye. A shattered illusion. The massive airport was significantly, incredibly quieter than I had actively expected entirely for a highly early Monday morning. Absolutely not completely silent. Just highly, weirdly, muffled. Exactly as if the entire massive world had aggressively turned the high volume completely down. Entirely to generously make massive room entirely for toxic thoughts that absolutely no one actively wanted. I held my young son Leo's tiny hand incredibly tight, exactly as we aggressively rolled our heavy, wheeled suitcase completely across the highly polished, hard floor. The cheap wheels loudly clicked completely in a highly steady, rhythmic pattern that surprisingly, beautifully, calmed me significantly more than I actively realized. Leo was highly half asleep. His soft hoodie aggressively zipped completely up entirely to his tiny chin. His heavy head resting peacefully entirely against my soft arm. We were officially supposed to actively fly entirely to vividly see my loving parents completely for exactly 1 short week. A highly simple, highly necessary trip. A massive, desperate reset. That was exactly what I had desperately told myself, exactly when I was frantically packing our cheap things the entire agonizing night completely before. Meticulously folding his tiny clothes completely with highly careful, exact precision. Pathetically, blindly pretending that the highly massive, toxic distance completely between my arrogant husband and me absolutely had not aggressively become so incredibly wide that it violently echoed. Dmitri had absolutely not responded entirely to my absolute last, highly urgent text message. We are officially at the massive airport. Gate 32. I toxically, blindly told myself that he was simply incredibly busy. He was absolutely always incredibly busy. The massive departure lounge aggressively smelled entirely of cheap, burnt coffee and highly harsh chemical disinfectant. The glowing screens violently flickered completely overhead. Massive flights aggressively scrolling entirely past, exactly like entire human lives, violently moving completely forward. Absolutely ready, or absolutely not. I rapidly checked my expensive phone completely again. Significantly more entirely out of pathetic habit than absolute, genuine hope. And violently shoved it completely back entirely into my heavy bag exactly when absolutely nothing had miraculously changed. And that was exactly when little Leo completely stopped actively walking. "Mom," he stated incredibly quietly. I rapidly followed his highly innocent gaze. At absolute first, I vividly saw absolutely only a highly familiar, striking silhouette. Incredibly broad shoulders, a highly expensive, bespoke tailored coat. The highly arrogant, confident posture entirely of a powerful man who absolutely always, profoundly, knew exactly where he was actively going. My fragile chest violently tightened completely before my brilliant mind could successfully catch completely up entirely to exactly what I was vividly seeing. Dmitri. He was confidently standing perfectly entirely near the highly exclusive, elite international check-in counters for exactly 1 highly microscopic, pathetic half-second. I genuinely felt absolute, pure relief, perhaps. He had miraculously come to beautifully see us completely off. Perhaps the highly toxic silence explicitly meant absolutely nothing. Perhaps I was completely catastrophically wrong entirely about absolutely all the highly terrifying things I quietly, desperately feared to explicitly name. Then, I vividly noticed the beautiful woman actively standing perfectly right next to him. She absolutely wasn't physically touching him, not explicitly. She was standing just incredibly close enough that their expensive sleeves gently brushed completely against each other. Incredibly close enough to actively, intimately belong entirely inside his highly private personal space. She laughed loudly entirely at something highly amusing he casually said, playfully tilting her beautiful head directly toward him entirely in a highly specific way that visually seemed incredibly, highly rehearsed. Utterly, completely intimate. Dmitri smiled radiantly completely back at her. It was a massive, beautiful smile that I had absolutely not vividly seen in agonizing months. My heavy breath violently caught, incredibly sharply and highly suddenly. Exactly as if the heavy air itself had aggressively turned completely against me. All completely around us, highly busy people frantically rushed completely past, entirely with official passports and highly specific purposes. Completely, utterly unaware that my entire massive life had literally just violently, catastrophically, split entirely open right in the absolute dead center, entirely of the massive airport terminal. Leo's incredibly tiny fingers aggressively tightened completely around mine. "Mom," he whispered softly again. Highly confused, but incredibly, beautifully calm. Dad is actively leaving too. For exactly several agonizing, heavy heartbeats, I absolutely did not physically move. I stood completely frozen there. Leo's tiny hand fiercely clamped entirely inside mine. My entire body violently froze, entirely, while my brilliant mind frantically, desperately attempted to fiercely protect me completely from exactly what my piercing eyes were absolutely already actively accepting. Dmitri was undeniably, actively there. Absolutely not a highly cruel optical illusion. Absolutely not just someone who highly coincidentally looked exactly like him. And for exactly one highly fragile, incredibly stupid, pathetic second, pure hope aggressively rose completely anyway. Perhaps the beautiful woman right beside him was simply an elite corporate colleague. Perhaps it was exactly one entirely of those highly rushed, massive business trips that he absolutely never, ever properly explained. Perhaps he was actively planning to miraculously surprise us, to confidently walk completely over entirely at absolutely any moment, and lovingly kiss Leo entirely on his tiny forehead, exactly as he beautifully used to do. I frantically clung entirely to that highly pathetic thought, exactly the specific way terrified people aggressively cling entirely to floating debris completely in deep, dark water, profoundly knowing that it absolutely will not miraculously save them, but actively being completely, utterly unable to violently let it completely go, to clearly hear her completely over the two, clearly hear her completely over the loud, chaotic noise entirely of the massive terminal. She said absolutely something I literally could not clearly hear, and he laughed incredibly softly, not highly politely, not entirely out of pathetic habit. It was a highly soft, incredibly genuine, massive laugh. The exact type of beautiful laugh that exclusively comes entirely from pure ease, from absolute, complete comfort, from highly deep, undeniable intimacy. My heavy stomach violently plummeted. This absolutely wasn't a highly coincidental, random proximity. This absolutely wasn't a pathetic coincidence. The highly intimate physical space completely between them absolutely wasn't the rigid space entirely of total strangers or elite colleagues. It was incredibly, highly rehearsed, utterly familiar, heavily earned entirely over massive time. A highly massive time that I absolutely wasn't entirely a single part of. Leo shifted slightly directly beside me. "Mom," he asked incredibly quietly, "why exactly isn't Dad actively waving completely at us?" I swallowed incredibly hard. My dry mouth slowly opened, but absolutely zero words successfully came. I absolutely did not fiercely trust myself to actively speak completely without violently breaking absolutely something highly important. Dimitri smoothly reached entirely for the highly expensive handle entirely of a massive suitcase. That absolutely wasn't his highly usual, large black one. It was significantly smaller, infinitely lighter, and completely, undeniably, hers. Their soft fingers gently touched, then intimately lingered entirely for exactly a microscopic fraction, entirely of a second, significantly longer than would ever absolutely be highly innocent. That was exactly when it violently, brutally hit me. Absolutely not exactly as blinding panic, but exactly as pure, absolute, highly terrifying clarity. He absolutely had not miraculously come to beautifully see us completely off. He was aggressively leaving entirely with her. She just caught her husband leaving with another woman. What would you do in this exact moment? Tell us below. The confrontation. The massive airport suddenly, violently felt way too incredibly bright. Way too completely, terrifyingly open. Every single loud announcement completely over the heavy public address system aggressively scratched entirely against my frayed nerves. Every single passing face visually seemed highly, incredibly intrusive. Exactly as if the entire massive terminal possessed absolute front row VIP seats entirely, to the absolute, brutal truth I had been cowardly avoiding entirely for agonizing months. I absolutely should have violently turned completely away. I absolutely should have fiercely spared Leo completely from this highly horrific, tragic sight. But my heavy legs absolutely refused to actively move. Completely pinned entirely by a highly complex mixture, entirely of absolute disbelief and a highly desperate, almost frantic need to vividly see exactly how incredibly far Dimitri would actually, arrogantly go completely without even bothering to look completely back. And then, he finally looked completely back, his piercing eyes violently locked completely onto us, and absolutely all the color completely, violently drained entirely from his handsome face. Absolutely zero guilt. Absolutely zero pathetic remorse. Pure, unadulterated fear. The beautiful woman right beside him smoothly followed his terrified gaze. Her beautiful expression violently shifted completely from highly casual curiosity, entirely, to highly cold calculation, entirely. In mere seconds. Her piercing eyes rapidly slid completely over me, then, entirely, over Leo. Actively evaluating, meticulously measuring, aggressively deciding. Dimitri aggressively straightened his broad shoulders, his sharp jaw violently clenched, exactly as if he were actively, fiercely bracing himself entirely for a massive, physical blow. I physically felt Leo's tiny grip aggressively tighten completely again. In that exact, highly terrifying moment, I profoundly realized absolutely something completely with highly horrifying, absolute certainty. Exactly whatever violently happened completely next, it would permanently, irrevocably, change absolutely all of us completely, forever. I absolutely only fully, vividly noticed her entirely after Dimitri completely, violently first. Before that exact microsecond, she was simply a highly blurred, fuzzy spot completely next to him, a highly vague outline, a highly toxic presence that my brilliant mind had actively resisted generously giving a solid shape. But exactly as Dimitri's massive body violently tensed and his heavy breath violently caught, my intense attention violently shifted completely to her, entirely with a highly sharp, completely involuntary focus. Highly confident, perfect posture. Highly confident, perfect posture. A highly relaxed, easy smile. The exact, pure lightness that exclusively comes entirely from blindly believing that the massive world is absolutely still incredibly generous. Her highly expensive coat was flawlessly tailored. Her bright hair was incredibly smooth and brilliantly shiny. Flawlessly, perfectly styled. Exactly as if she had meticulously checked her beautiful reflection significantly, more than exactly once completely, before confidently entering the massive terminal. She smoothly followed Dimitri's highly terrified gaze and effortlessly found me. Her piercing eyes rapidly moved completely across my pale face. My highly simple clothes, the highly protective arm I held incredibly tightly, completely around my young son. In her beautiful expression, there was absolutely zero blinding shock, absolutely zero pathetic embarrassment, just exactly one highly brief, short pause. Then, absolute, total comprehension. And then, something completely else. Absolute recognition. Not entirely of me, but entirely of the highly explosive situation. Exactly as if she had vividly imagined this highly terrifying moment entirely before, and had completely, perfectly decided entirely in advance exactly how she would confidently stand entirely in it. She absolutely did not actively step completely away entirely from Dimitri. She absolutely did not visually look highly awkward. Instead, she slightly, beautifully, shifted her soft weight significantly closer, directly to him. Her delicate shoulder gently touched his massive arm completely again, highly subtly, but incredibly, fiercely, intentionally. A highly silent, toxic claim. Finally, Dimitri desperately spoke. Although I literally could not successfully hear the heavy words completely from exactly where I was actively standing. His lips were rapidly moving way too incredibly fast. His handsome head was highly tilted directly toward her, exactly as if he were frantically explaining, desperately making highly pathetic excuses. She intensely listened, her beautiful head highly tilted, her piercing eyes absolutely still violently fixed completely on me. Her soft mouth slowly curved completely into exactly what wasn't exactly a full smile. Absolutely not highly cruel, but highly, undeniably confident. Leo gently pulled entirely on my soft arm. "Mom," he whispered incredibly softly. "Who exactly is she?" The highly innocent question violently dropped significantly heavier than absolutely anything else entirely on that horrific morning. I smoothly dropped directly to my weak knees entirely beside him. My knees were incredibly, terrifyingly weak. My massive heart was violently beating so incredibly loudly that I was absolutely terrified he could clearly hear it. I frantically searched entirely for highly gentle language that would absolutely not violently leave deep, permanent scars completely on him. An absolute truth, highly soft enough to flawlessly hold. "She is absolutely just someone that Dad professionally knows," I stated incredibly carefully. The beautiful woman actively watched this highly intimate exchange completely with highly open, massive curiosity. Absolutely not with toxic guilt. Absolutely not with pathetic shame. She was intensely studying me, actively assessing exactly how I might highly possibly react. If I would violently cry, aggressively scream. If I would violently cause a massive, highly public scene that she had highly likely meticulously prepared herself entirely for. I generously gave her absolutely none of that. I slowly, confidently, stood completely up, gently smoothing Leo's soft hair, aggressively forcing my rapid breathing to flawlessly, even completely out. I met her piercing gaze directly, completely head-on entirely for the absolute first time. I vividly saw it incredibly clearly. Right then, she genuinely, toxically, thought she had miraculously won absolutely something massive. Absolutely not entirely Dimitri, but the highly coveted position completely next to him. The highly elite role, the highly toxic illusion entirely of actively being fiercely chosen. She absolutely did not profoundly know that she was actively standing directly in the absolute middle entirely of a massive story that would violently cost her significantly more than she ever actively imagined. And absolutely none of us completely knew it yet. But this was absolutely only the highly terrifying beginning. Dimitri was the absolute first to actively break the heavy silence. He absolutely did not frantically rush directly toward us. He absolutely did not pathetically apologize. He absolutely didn't even bother to explicitly ask exactly how Leo was doing. Instead, he actively took a highly slow, measured step completely forward. Exactly as if he were cautiously approaching a highly hostile corporate negotiation. Absolutely not his very own beautiful family. His broad shoulders aggressively squared. His handsome face flawlessly adopted that highly familiar, highly calculated expression he absolutely always utilized entirely in elite meetings. The exact one that was meticulously designed entirely to actively project absolute control. "Elena," he stated, highly successfully keeping his deep voice incredibly low, highly calm, incredibly cautious. "We can actively talk completely about this entirely somewhere else." Somewhere else? Not, "I am highly sorry." Not, "This absolutely isn't exactly what it looks like." Not even, "We desperately need to actively talk." Just a highly sterile, pathetic relocation. Pure, unadulterated damage control. I profoundly realized right then that he absolutely wasn't violently panicking entirely because he had brutally hurt me. He was violently panicking entirely because he had been vividly seen. Normal people actively walked completely between us, heavily dragging loud luggage, happily laughing, frantically checking expensive watches. The highly mundane normality entirely of absolutely all of it physically felt incredibly, violently cruel. Dimitri aggressively looked completely around, his sharp jaw violently clenching exactly as he highly actively noticed exactly how incredibly public this was rapidly becoming. "This is absolutely not the proper place," he aggressively added, his deep tone slightly, violently sharpening. "Let's absolutely not actively do this right here. Do this." Exactly as if I was the highly unstable one actively creating a massive toxic problem. Leo gently moved significantly closer, entirely to me, his tiny body instinctively, desperately, seeking highly secure cover. I physically felt his tiny fingers aggressively press entirely into my soft palm, beautifully grounding me entirely in a highly profound way that Dimitri had absolutely never, ever successfully done. "You absolutely did not explicitly tell me that you were actively traveling today," I stated incredibly evenly. I was highly surprised entirely by exactly how incredibly firm my beautiful voice actually sounded. With her, Dimitri exhaled heavily, completely through his clenched teeth. Pure irritation violently flashed entirely across his handsome face completely before he flawlessly hid it. "It is highly, incredibly complicated. It was his absolute second massive mistake. Complicated is exactly what highly toxic, guilty people pathetically say exactly when the absolute truth is absolutely not entirely in their massive favor. He quickly glanced completely back, entirely, at the beautiful woman, Alina, exactly as I would horrifyingly discover significantly later. Then, completely back, directly at me, aggressively lowering his deep voice even significantly further. We will absolutely thoroughly discuss this highly privately later. I will absolutely call you. I absolutely do not desperately want Leo to actively hear massive things that he absolutely does not desperately need to actively hear. Absolutely something massive entirely inside me violently turned to freezing ice. He was absolutely already aggressively framing this exactly as my highly potential, catastrophic failure. Exactly as my highly volatile, emotional instability. Exactly as something massive that I might absolutely not be able to flawlessly handle. I genuinely think Leo absolutely already profoundly knows exactly enough, I sharply replied. Dimitri's piercing eyes finally, violently darted completely down entirely to his young son, entirely for the absolute first time. "Hey, buddy," he stated, flawlessly forcing a highly fake, toxic smile that absolutely did not successfully reach his freezing eyes. "Are you perfectly okay?" Leo absolutely did not respond. He simply intensely stared directly at his arrogant father completely, with an incredibly serious expression that was way too incredibly adult, entirely for his young age. Highly quiet, incredibly observant, deeply, profoundly disappointed. Alina awkwardly shifted directly next to Dimitri, highly clearly physically feeling incredibly uncomfortable, exactly now, although she desperately tried to flawlessly hide it. The highly explosive situation was absolutely no longer incredibly neat. Absolutely no longer completely controlled. Dimitri aggressively straightened completely back up. His deep voice violently became significantly firmer. "We will actively discuss this completely in private. I will absolutely call you." He stated it exactly as a highly definitive conclusion. Exactly as an absolute, already finalized decision, and entirely in that exact, highly terrifying moment. I profoundly understood exactly who Dimitri truly, genuinely was. Exactly when absolutely everything absolutely did not perfectly go entirely according completely to his highly arrogant plan. A highly toxic man who genuinely believed that absolute calmness was pure power. A toxic man who arrogantly thought that highly freezing silence explicitly meant absolute victory. A highly pathetic man who possessed absolutely zero microscopic idea exactly how incredibly much he was actively about to violently, permanently lose. Dimitri is trying to act like nothing is wrong. What would you say to him to expose his lies? Comment below. The child's clarity. Dimitri's highly forced, toxic smile violently hung completely in the heavy air. Incredibly thin and highly fragile. Exactly like cheap glass, violently stretched way too incredibly far. He impatiently waited entirely for Leo to actively respond, highly likely desperately expecting a tiny nod. A highly simple word. Absolutely anything that would magically allow him to pathetically pretend that this highly explosive moment could absolutely still be flawlessly managed. Leo said absolutely nothing. Instead, he intensely looked directly at his arrogant father completely, with incredibly calm, quiet eyes. The exact type of eyes that absolutely no longer actively sought highly pathetic comfort. I physically felt his tiny hand smoothly release completely from mine exactly as he bravely took exactly one tiny step completely forward. Absolutely no longer cowardly hiding completely behind me. "Dad," he stated incredibly quietly. Dimitri's broad shoulders completely relaxed, just a tiny microscopic bit, exactly as if completely with pure relief. "Yes, buddy." Leo violently hesitated. I vividly saw the highly complex thoughts aggressively lining completely up, entirely behind his beautiful eyes. Incredibly slow and highly careful. He absolutely wasn't completely confused. He absolutely wasn't violently angry. He was desperately attempting to profoundly understand absolutely something highly complex that the toxic adults had completely, miserably failed to actively explain. "Are you actively going entirely on a massive trip completely with her?" he explicitly asked, gently nodding directly toward Alina. "Because you absolutely do not desperately want to actively come completely back home entirely with us anymore?" The heavy words were incredibly, beautifully simple. There was absolutely zero highly toxic accusation entirely in them. Absolutely zero violently raised voice. Just a highly honest, pure attempt, entirely by an innocent child, to flawlessly put the highly shattered pieces completely into their proper places. Completely again. Exactly whatever highly completely again. Exactly whatever highly pathetic, fake answer he had meticulously prepared entirely for me. Exactly whatever highly toxic version entirely of the absolute truth he arrogantly thought he could seamlessly sell. It completely, catastrophically collapsed entirely under the massive, crushing weight entirely of that highly simple, innocent question. Alina violently tensed, entirely for the absolute first time. Her highly arrogant confidence finally showed a massive, highly visible crack. She intensely looked directly at Dimitri, desperately expecting him to miraculously fix it, to actively explain, to fiercely protect the highly toxic, fake image she had confidently walked completely into. He absolutely did not. Highly curious people entirely nearby aggressively slowed their busy pace. Some pathetically pretended absolutely not to be intensely listening, although they were highly clearly actively doing exactly that. The loud, chaotic noise entirely of the massive airport physically seemed to violently quiet completely down, entirely replaced completely by the highly silent, suffocating pressure entirely of massive public attention. "It absolutely is not," Dimitri nervously began, then completely stopped. He violently swallowed incredibly hard. "It absolutely is not exactly that incredibly simple." Leo slightly frowned. "But it visually seems incredibly simple." I physically felt my fragile chest violently tighten. I desperately wanted to violently pull Leo completely back, to fiercely shield him entirely from the highly toxic, freezing silence that violently followed, entirely from the absolute truth that Dimitri was way too incredibly, pathetically cowardly to explicitly say entirely out loud. But absolutely something massive internally told me to stand perfectly still, to generously allow this highly explosive moment to actively, freely exist. Dimitri slowly dropped directly to his knees. His highly rigid movements were exactly now incredibly awkward, highly uncertain. "Buddy, highly complex, adult things can absolutely be incredibly confusing," he stated. His deep voice was significantly rougher than completely before. "Sometimes, highly important people actively make massive, terrible mistakes." Leo gently tilted his tiny head. "Then exactly why do you visually look so incredibly terrified, Dad?" That flawless hit its absolute mark. Dimitri completely, utterly froze, his massive hands violently hovering completely uselessly, entirely in the heavy air. He looked exactly, perfectly, like exactly who he truly, genuinely was. A highly pathetic, cornered man. Absolutely not entirely by blinding anger or massive confrontation, but entirely by an innocent child who vividly saw completely, flawlessly, right through his toxic lies completely, without a single ounce entirely of effort. I physically felt hot tears aggressively burning entirely behind my eyes, but I absolutely did not generously allow them to violently fall. This absolutely wasn't the exact moment entirely for my massive pain. This was the absolute, highly critical moment exactly when his biological son vividly saw exactly who he truly, genuinely was. And Dmitri profoundly knew it too. Because exactly when he finally looked directly at me, absolute, crushing shame had finally, violently, replaced the pure fear entirely in his piercing eyes, and entirely for the absolute first time that morning. He profoundly realized absolutely something completely irrevocable. Meticulously, he aggressively tried to violently rewrite the toxic history. The absolute, brutal truth had absolutely already been explicitly spoken. And it absolutely did not actively come completely from me. The manipulation tactic, Dmitri slowly, highly rigidly rose completely from his awkward crouch, his handsome face violently tightening exactly as if he were actively bracing entirely for a highly invisible, massive blow. The massive, crushing shame that Leo had miraculously, flawlessly exposed actively lasted exactly for only a highly brief, microscopic moment, completely before it was violently replaced entirely by absolutely something significantly colder. I intimately recognized that highly toxic, freezing look. I had vividly seen it entirely before. Entirely in highly explosive, late-night arguments exactly when he profoundly realized he absolutely could not successfully win completely with highly logical explanations. So he aggressively changed his toxic tactics. "All right," he stated incredibly quietly, aggressively adjusting his expensive designer jacket. His deep voice violently dropping completely back, entirely to that highly calm, incredibly measured, toxic tone he absolutely always used completely with highly difficult corporate clients. "That is absolutely enough entirely for right now. Enough. I am incredibly sorry that you actively had to clearly hear that. I absolutely should not have actively put you entirely in this highly uncomfortable position. Just absolutely enough." Then he aggressively leaned incredibly 100 feet away. Then he aggressively leaned incredibly close, completely to me, violently lowering his deep voice so incredibly low that absolutely only I could clearly hear it. "You absolutely do not desperately need to actively make this significantly, infinitely worse," he stated. "Let's actively talk completely about this significantly later, exactly like mature, rational adults." Absolutely something massive entirely inside me violently snapped, because I profoundly understood exactly what he was actively doing. He absolutely wasn't actively talking completely to me exactly like an equal partner. He was highly toxically positioning me entirely as a massive risk. Exactly as a highly volatile problem that desperately needed to be efficiently solved completely before I violently compromised him even significantly more. Absolutely no one is actively making absolutely anything significantly worse, I replied just as incredibly quietly. It is absolutely already violently happening. Dimitri's sharp jaw aggressively clenched. "You are being highly emotional," he stated, barely even actively moving his lips. And Leo absolutely does not desperately need to be entirely in the absolute middle entirely of this highly toxic scene. The heavy words violently landed exactly, flawlessly, where he had maliciously intended them to. You are being highly emotional. You are highly unstable. You are the absolute massive danger completely here. I physically felt white-hot heat violently rising entirely behind my eyes. Blinding anger violently mixing completely with absolute disbelief. For agonizing years, I had aggressively, constantly softened myself entirely to flawlessly keep the highly fragile peace. I violently swallowed massive disappointments, actively postponed highly important, critical conversations, highly toxically convincing myself that absolute patience was pure strength. And exactly now, standing perfectly still, entirely in the absolute middle, entirely of the massive airport, completely with our innocent son, right between us. He was actively, desperately attempting to violently rewrite the entire scene so that I was the highly hysterical one who had violently spun completely out of control. Leo gently pressed completely against my soft side, completely again. His tiny body actively reacting completely before his brilliant mind could fully process the highly toxic, massive shift. He absolutely no longer actively looked completely at Dmitri. He intensely looked directly at me. Alina highly awkwardly shifted her weight, highly clearly, physically feeling the massive aggressive shift entirely in the toxic energy. This absolutely wasn't the highly clean, perfect break she had beautifully imagined. This was incredibly messy, highly public, highly, profoundly human. Dmitri, I stated, fiercely, directly meeting his piercing gaze. You absolutely do not get to arrogantly decide exactly how this highly horrific scene visually looks. His handsome expression violently hardened. I am desperately attempting to fiercely protect absolutely everyone. It was his absolute biggest, most toxic lie. He absolutely wasn't fiercely protecting Leo. He absolutely wasn't fiercely protecting me. He was aggressively, selfishly protecting himself. The exact, highly arrogant man who genuinely believed that if he was simply calm enough, quiet enough, rational enough, the absolute truth would violently bend completely around him. I profoundly realized right then that this highly explosive moment absolutely wasn't entirely just completely about a massive betrayal. It was entirely about absolute control, and entirely for the absolute first time. I profoundly understood absolutely something massive that miraculously made my soft hand completely stop violently trembling. If I remained completely silent right now, he would maliciously, aggressively use that highly toxic silence completely against me significantly later. And absolutely no matter exactly what violently happened completely next, I absolutely could not generously allow that to highly possibly happen. Absolutely not entirely for myself, and absolutely not entirely for my beautiful son. Dmitri is gaslighting Elena and calling her emotional. Have you ever dealt with a narcissist like this? How did you handle it? The mistress's delusion. Alina was the absolute first to completely successfully recover, while Dmitri and I remained locked entirely in a highly silent, toxic standoff. She aggressively adjusted her perfect posture, exactly as if silently reminding herself exactly where her highly coveted place supposedly was. Her slender shoulders aggressively squared, her delicate chin slightly raised, and she flawlessly smoothed a highly invisible, tiny wrinkle completely on her expensive coat. It was a highly small, incredibly subtle movement, almost highly graceful, but it aggressively carried a highly toxic message significantly louder than absolutely any words. She absolutely wasn't actively leaving. Her piercing eyes fiercely met mine completely again. This specific time, highly openly, absolutely not defiantly, absolutely not highly apologetically, highly curiously, intensely studying, exactly as if she were actively watching a highly dramatic play and aggressively deciding exactly if it was flawlessly following the highly scripted plan. Then, she beautifully smiled. It absolutely wasn't incredibly wide or highly mocking. It was highly subtle, incredibly contained. A highly calculated expression perfectly rehearsed enough to easily pass entirely as highly polite if absolutely anyone actively asked. But completely beneath it was absolutely something highly toxic that actively made my stomach violently churn. Absolute confidence. She genuinely, toxically believed that this highly explosive moment completely belonged entirely to her. "Dmitri," she stated incredibly softly. Finally, intimately touching his massive arm completely again. "We will absolutely miss our massive boarding if we absolutely do not aggressively go." The highly intimate contact was incredibly intentional, highly effortless, utterly familiar. She explicitly stated it exactly as a highly gentle reminder. Absolutely not a pathetic request. Dmitri violently hesitated entirely for exactly one single microscopic second. His piercing eyes violently darted completely to Leo, then violently right back entirely to Alina's soft hand, resting perfectly on his expensive sleeve. I intensely watched the massive, highly toxic calculation actively happen, completely in real time, aggressively weighing the highly catastrophic consequences, instinctively, cowardly choosing the absolute path that actively required the absolute least amount entirely of immediate massive discomfort. He absolutely did not actively remove her soft hand. Instead, he nodded fiercely. "Generously give me exactly 1 short minute." Alina aggressively stepped completely back exactly half a step, but her highly toxic, confident smile beautifully lingered as she smoothly turned completely away, absolutely already highly confident entirely in the massive outcome, exactly as if she profoundly knew he would absolutely, blindly follow her. I profoundly understood right then. She absolutely wasn't incredibly nervous. She absolutely wasn't violently afraid entirely of me or the highly explosive situation. She had absolutely already fiercely decided exactly how this highly tragic story would perfectly end. In her highly toxic version, Dmitri would successfully calm me completely down. He would flawlessly explain absolutely everything. He would confidently walk completely away entirely with her, and I would eventually, quietly fade completely into the highly pathetic background, highly emotional, incredibly inconvenient, easily manageable. She arrogantly thought she was the absolute massive prize, exactly at the end, entirely of a highly difficult, tedious conversation. Leo gently leaned significantly closer, entirely to me. His tiny voice was barely highly audible. "She visually looks incredibly happy," he stated. I swallowed incredibly hard. Sometimes, highly toxic people happily smile exactly when they arrogantly think they are absolutely right, I carefully, softly replied. Dmitri violently turned completely back entirely to me, blinding urgency actively creeping entirely into his deep tone. "We will absolutely thoroughly talk entirely tonight," he stated. "I fiercely promise. Just, please actively take Leo and safely go. Please." The heavy words sounded completely, utterly hollow exactly now. I looked intensely, completely past him, directly at Alina, who was actively waiting exactly a few short steps, completely away, highly casually scrolling completely through her expensive phone, exactly as if absolutely nothing highly significant was actively happening, exactly as if she hadn't literally just violently stepped completely into the absolute dead center entirely of a massive family collapse, and entirely in that exact, highly magical moment. Absolutely something massive entirely inside me violently shifted. Not blinding anger, not toxic jealousy. Absolute pure clarity. Alina genuinely, toxically believed she had miraculously won. Entirely because Dmitri had actively chosen her completely publicly. Entirely because he absolutely had not violently rejected her. Entirely because he was actively about to confidently walk completely away completely without ever looking entirely back. Exactly what she absolutely did not completely understand. Exactly what absolutely neither of them completely understood just yet. Was that this absolutely wasn't a massive victory. It was a massive, highly catastrophic mistake that would violently, aggressively haunt absolutely both of them significantly, infinitely longer than absolutely either of them actively anticipated. The departure. I absolutely did not aggressively attempt to violently argue completely with him. That highly unexpected reaction actively seemed to profoundly surprise Dmitri, significantly more than absolutely anything else. He had meticulously braced himself completely for massive resistance, for highly dramatic tears, for violently raised voices, for highly complex questions that he absolutely did not desperately want to actively answer. He had flawlessly rehearsed highly calm, toxic responses. He had meticulously practiced fake patience. Exactly what he absolutely had not aggressively prepared himself entirely for was my absolute freezing silence. I intensely looked directly at him entirely for the absolute final time. Absolutely not completely with blinding anger, but completely with absolutely something significantly more highly unsettling. Absolute detachment. Okay, I stated. Just the highly simple, heavy word violently dropping completely between us. Incredibly flat and highly final. Dmitri rapidly blinked, highly clearly completely unsure entirely if he had actually successfully heard me correctly. Just exactly like that? He demanded. I nodded fiercely. Just exactly like that. Absolutely zero highly dramatic accusations. Absolutely zero toxic ultimatums. I absolutely did not desperately need them. The absolute brutal truth was absolutely already actively standing perfectly between us, vividly breathing. Utterly undeniable. I smoothly turned directly to Leo and gracefully crouched completely down to perfectly match his tiny level. His massive eyes actively searched my pale face, frantically looking completely for highly terrifying signs entirely of blinding panic, deep confusion, or absolute fear. I generously gave him absolutely none of that. Hey, I stated incredibly softly, gently brushing his dark hair completely back. We are absolutely still actively taking our massive flight. Without Dad? He asked softly. Yes, I replied. Just exactly the two of us. He deeply thought entirely about it completely for exactly one highly brief moment. Then fiercely nodded. Okay. That highly quiet, absolute acceptance violently broke, absolutely something massive, completely inside my heavy chest. I confidently stood completely up and aggressively reached entirely for our heavy suitcase. The cold handle physically felt incredibly cool, completely under my soft fingers. The highly simple, heavy weight entirely of it physically felt incredibly grounding. Highly real, I gently took Leo's tiny hand completely again, and smoothly turned entirely away, completely from Dimitri. Entirely, without a single additional word. Directly behind us, I clearly heard him violently exhale incredibly sharply. "Elena!" I absolutely did not actively stop. Every single deliberate step entirely away, completely from him, physically, felt incredibly surreal. Exactly as if I were confidently walking completely out, entirely of a highly familiar room I had actively lived completely in, entirely, for agonizing years. Absolutely not completely knowing exactly where the heavy door actively led. The highly chaotic sounds entirely of the massive terminal aggressively became significantly louder, completely again. Loud announcements, bright laughter, heavily rolling luggage, normal life violently rushing completely back entirely around us. I absolutely did not actively look completely back. I profoundly knew that if I actually did, I might highly possibly vividly see pathetic hesitation, or toxic regret, or blinding fear. And absolutely none of that mattered a single microscopic bit anymore. Exactly what truly, genuinely mattered was the exact, perfect way Leo's tiny hand flawlessly rested entirely inside mine. The exact way his tiny footsteps flawlessly matched mine completely, without absolutely any questions. The exact way he completely, utterly blindly trusted me. Entirely in a massive moment, exactly when absolutely everything completely else had violently shifted. As we confidently walked, my expensive phone violently vibrated entirely in my heavy bag. I absolutely did not aggressively check it. Not completely yet. Dimitri could absolutely, definitely wait. The highly pathetic explanations could wait. The toxic excuses, the highly fake apologies he might highly eventually pathetically offer. Absolutely all of it could completely wait. Because exactly in that highly profound moment, confidently walking completely away, entirely through the massive crowd completely with my beautiful son, directly by my side, I profoundly realized absolutely something massive completely, with highly startling, absolute clarity. Walking completely away was absolutely not a pathetic weakness. It was the absolute very first, highly massive decision I had actively made, completely entirely for myself entirely, in a very incredibly long time. And although I had absolutely zero idea exactly what the absolute next hour would violently bring, the absolute next day, or the absolute next agonizing year, I profoundly knew exactly this completely for certain. Exactly whatever violently happened completely after this, it would absolutely, 100% never be entirely on his highly toxic terms, ever again. Elena left without causing a scene. Do you think walking away in silence is stronger than yelling? Share your opinion below. The financial betrayal. The highly sterile hotel room was incredibly quiet. Exactly in the highly specific way that completely unfamiliar places are absolutely always incredibly quiet. Way too incredibly quiet. Exactly as if the thin walls were actively, intensely listening. Leo rapidly fell deeply asleep, completely exhausted entirely by the highly traumatic morning. His tiny chest beautifully rising and falling completely in a highly steady, rhythmic pattern. I intensely watched him entirely for an incredibly long time, completely, before finally, softly turning entirely off the small bedside lamp, meticulously memorizing the absolute, pure peace entirely on his beautiful face. exactly as if I could flawlessly save it completely for significantly later. Only then did I generously permit myself to sit heavily, entirely on the absolute edge, entirely of the massive bed. My soft hands were violently trembling. I desperately reached completely for my expensive phone. Finally, completely ready to vividly see exactly what I had been aggressively avoiding the entire agonizing day. Exactly 3 missed calls. Exactly 2 urgent text messages completely from Dimitri. I absolutely did not aggressively open them. Not completely yet. Instead, I rapidly opened our highly secure joint banking application. My absolute only intention was simply to accurately check the massive balance. Absolutely something highly routine, highly grounding. The bright screen slowly loaded, rapidly refreshed, and my heavy stomach completely, violently plummeted. The highly secure, massive joint account was almost completely, utterly empty. Not heavily overdrawn, not legally frozen, simply maliciously emptied. Massive, highly significant transfers, explicitly dated agonizing weeks completely ago. Massive sums, highly cautiously, methodically, moved completely away. The heavy rent money, the massive savings, the highly secure emergency fund we had fiercely promised to absolutely never, ever touch. Absolutely all of it, completely gone. For exactly one massive, terrifying moment, I literally could not successfully breathe. My fragile chest violently tightened so incredibly hard that it physically felt highly tangible. Exactly like a massive, heavy hand aggressively pressing completely inward. I frantically refreshed the bright screen completely again. Exactly as if the complex numbers could magically, flawlessly correct themselves. They absolutely did not. These absolutely were not highly panicked, chaotic splurges. This absolutely wasn't a pathetic accident. This was highly calculated, massive preparation. I aggressively scrolled completely through the highly detailed transaction history entirely with completely numb fingers. Every single highly damning line flawlessly confirmed exactly what I absolutely did not desperately want to genuinely believe. Dimitri absolutely wasn't entirely just actively planning a highly secret trip. He was meticulously, actively planning a massive, highly calculated exit. My expensive phone violently buzzed completely again. This specific time, it was a highly formal email. We urgently need to actively talk entirely about highly complex arrangements, legal custody, massive finances. I absolutely do not desperately want this to violently become incredibly messy. I stared blankly entirely at the heavy words, my blurred vision violently blurring. Arrangements. Exactly as if our entire, beautiful life, completely together, was simply a highly annoying scheduling conflict entirely in his rigid calendar. Exactly as if he absolutely hadn't completely, maliciously ensured that I would violently land heavily on my feet entirely, with absolutely nothing completely beneath me. I aggressively looked completely around the highly sterile room, the highly neutral blank walls, the completely unfamiliar, cheap furniture, the heavy suitcase absolutely still only half unpacked. For the absolute first time that entire, chaotic day, blinding fear quietly, aggressively, crept completely in, violently wrapping completely around my fragile ribs. I possessed absolutely zero highly secure backup plan, absolutely zero elite lawyer, absolutely zero private savings, only a deeply sleeping child and an absolute brutal truth that was significantly sharper than absolutely anything I had ever faced completely before. I sat completely frozen there until my thin legs violently went completely numb, frantically replaying the highly traumatic morning entirely in my brilliant head. The massive airport, his highly calm, toxic voice, the exact way he aggressively asked me absolutely not to actively make it significantly worse. Exactly now. I profoundly understood exactly what he had maliciously meant. He absolutely had not aggressively expected me to horrifyingly find completely out so incredibly fast. I lay gently, completely down, entirely next to Leo, desperately trying incredibly hard, absolutely not, to violently wake him, and stared intensely directly at the blank ceiling completely until my beautiful eyes violently began to aggressively burn. Somewhere incredibly deep, completely beneath the blinding shock and massive fear, a highly brand new, massive emotion aggressively began to beautifully emerge, incredibly slow, highly unfamiliar, and incredibly, lethally dangerous entirely for absolutely someone exactly like Dimitri. Absolute, unbreakable determination. Because if he arrogantly, toxically, thought that violently taking absolutely everything would magically leave me completely, utterly powerless. He had catastrophically, massively underestimated the absolute single thing he had absolutely never, ever successfully managed to actively control. Exactly what I would violently do. Exactly when I had absolutely nothing massive left to violently lose. The documented war, bright morning arrived way too incredibly fast. Leo violently woke completely up, happily asking entirely for sweet cereal and loud cartoons, utterly, completely unaware that the solid ground completely beneath our fragile lives had violently shifted entirely overnight. I smiled radiantly directly at him, poured the sweet juice, carefully tied his tiny shoes entirely with highly steady hands that I literally could not physically feel. I patiently waited completely until he was highly distracted entirely by his glowing tablet completely before smoothly opening my expensive laptop entirely at the small table directly by the large window. Dimitri had aggressively sent absolutely another highly formal email. The toxic tone was incredibly polite, highly neutral, almost highly professional. Subject: highly important. Next steps. My heavy pulse violently pounded entirely in my ears, exactly as I slowly opened it. He extensively wrote entirely about highly complex logistics, about strict schedules, about exactly what would supposedly be absolute best entirely for little Leo. He highly arrogantly mentioned his incredibly demanding, elite career, my highly flexible, simple job, and the massive importance entirely of absolute stability. Then came the highly toxic, massive sentence that violently made my soft hands completely turn to freezing ice. Given exactly how highly emotional you actively were yesterday, I genuinely believe it would be highly prudent to actively keep absolutely all our highly complex conversations strictly documented. Documented. Exactly as if I was a highly volatile liability. Exactly as if he was absolutely already aggressively building a massive legal case. I aggressively scrolled completely down, my sharp jaw violently clenching completely with every single highly toxic line. He was aggressively offering highly temporary, limited custody completely until absolutely everything peacefully settled, completely down. He was aggressively suggesting I permanently, formally move completely out, entirely, of the massive apartment. He toxically framed absolutely all of it entirely as pure care, exactly as absolute reasonableness, exactly as profound responsibility. Absolutely not once did he explicitly mention the massive missing money. Absolutely not once did he actively acknowledge exactly what he had maliciously taken. This was absolutely no longer pathetic damage control. This was highly calculated, elite corporate strategy. I incredibly slowly closed the expensive laptop, my pale reflection staring intensely, completely back, entirely at me, completely from the dark screen. For agonizing years, I had toxically told myself that Dimitri was simply highly avoidant, absolutely not brutally cruel, simply highly conflict-averse, absolutely not highly calculating. I had been completely, catastrophically wrong. A sharp knock entirely on the heavy door violently made me physically jump. I frantically checked the small peephole, my massive heart violently pounding. Then, visibly relaxed, exactly when I clearly saw the friendly housekeeper. I politely, softly declined the service and aggressively locked the heavy door completely again. Suddenly, highly, terrifyingly aware, entirely, of exactly how incredibly vulnerable I profoundly felt, entirely in the completely unfamiliar place, Leo slowly looked completely up entirely from his glowing tablet. "Mom, are we perfectly okay?" I confidently crossed the sterile room and sat heavily directly beside him, gently pulling him completely close entirely to me. "We are perfectly okay," I stated, meticulously, highly carefully choosing my heavy words. "Massive things are actively changing, but I am absolutely right here, completely with you." He nodded fiercely, blindly trusting me completely without a single ounce of hesitation. That absolute, pure trust physically held significantly heavier than massive fear. I smoothly opened the expensive laptop completely again. Absolutely not to actively reply directly to Dimitri, but to aggressively research. Complex family law, highly contested custody rights, massive financial disclosure, elite mediation strategy. Every single, highly complex new page physically felt exactly like taking a massive step entirely into a highly terrifying world I had absolutely never, ever desperately wanted to actively explore. But exactly now, I possessed absolutely zero choice completely, but to thoroughly, profoundly understand it. By the exact time Leo happily finished his sweet breakfast, absolutely something massive entirely inside me had beautifully calmed completely down. Dimitri arrogantly thought he possessed the massive upper hand entirely because he heavily possessed massive money, highly toxic confidence, and a massive head start. He arrogantly thought that highly calm, polite emails and highly cautious legal phrasing could magically rewrite the absolute truth. Exactly what he absolutely did not know. Exactly what he could absolutely not visibly see yet, was that completely by actively turning this highly explosive situation entirely into a highly calculated, cold equation, he had completely made his absolute, greatest, massive mistake, because I was completely, permanently, finished desperately attempting to pathetically save the highly toxic image entirely of a shattered marriage that absolutely no longer miraculously existed. And if he desperately wanted absolutely everything to be strictly documented, meticulously measured, and legally resolved entirely on thick paper, then I would absolutely, fiercely meet him perfectly there, completely awake, entirely present, and absolutely no longer highly terrified. Dimitri emptied their bank accounts. How should Elena prepare for the legal battle ahead? Share your best advice below. The child's perspective. Leo said absolutely nothing completely for the absolute vast majority entirely of the highly quiet morning. That violently worried me significantly more than highly dramatic tears. He sat incredibly quietly, entirely at the small table directly by the large window, meticulously lining completely up his tiny toy cars, completely with highly unusual, extreme care. Exactly as if absolute, perfect order itself could magically hold the massive world completely from violently shifting completely again. I intensely watched him, pathetically pretending to actively check my complex emails. My intense attention violently torn completely between the glowing screen and the highly subtle, tiny shifts entirely in his small movements. He was actively thinking. Highly intelligent children absolutely always are. Even exactly when arrogant adults highly foolishly assume they absolutely are not. When he finally softly spoke, his tiny voice was incredibly quiet, almost highly casual. "Mom." "Yes, sweetheart." He absolutely did not immediately look completely up. He gently pushed exactly one tiny car completely forward, then completely stopped. "I violently upset Dad yesterday." The massive question violently struck me significantly harder than Dimitri's highly toxic email ever highly possibly could. I violently closed the expensive laptop and confidently moved significantly closer, sitting heavily, completely opposite entirely from him. "Why exactly do you strongly think that?" Leo lightly shrugged. He visually looked incredibly different. Exactly like when I accidentally break absolutely something massive, and I absolutely do not know exactly how to flawlessly fix it. My dry throat violently tightened. I gently reached completely for his tiny hands, incredibly warm and highly small, entirely inside mine. "You absolutely did not violently upset absolutely anyone," I stated incredibly softly. "You simply asked a highly simple question. That is absolutely not a bad thing." He nodded fiercely, deeply absorbing it, but his tiny forehead remained heavily furrowed. He absolutely did not actively reply directly to me. I took a massive, incredibly slow breath. Sometimes, highly complex adults absolutely do not actively answer entirely because the absolute answer is incredibly difficult, I stated. Absolutely not entirely, because you absolutely shouldn't have actively asked. Leo remained completely silent entirely for a highly long, agonizing time. Then, he slowly looked directly at me. His massive eyes were incredibly calm and highly serious, in a massive way that absolutely did not perfectly fit his incredibly young age. "Absolutely no one ever explicitly asks exactly how you actively feel, Mom." The heavy words violently knocked absolutely all the breath completely out of me. I stared blankly directly at him, completely, utterly stunned. Absolutely not entirely by exactly what he explicitly said, but entirely by exactly how incredibly clearly he vividly saw. Exactly how he had highly profoundly noticed the highly toxic silence completely around me incredibly long before I had ever actively named it completely myself. "I vividly see it," he aggressively continued, his tiny voice incredibly calm. "Dad highly actively talks an incredibly lot. You highly actively listen an incredibly lot, but absolutely no one ever explicitly asks you. Absolutely something massive, entirely inside my heavy chest, violently cracked, completely wide open. I aggressively pulled him completely into my warm arms, fiercely hugging him significantly tighter than I actually intended, deeply inhaling the highly familiar, beautiful scent entirely of his soft hair. Hot tears violently broke completely free, entirely before I could successfully stop them, falling completely silently, entirely onto his tiny shoulder. "I am perfectly fine," I whispered brokenly. although I absolutely wasn't completely sure entirely if I was desperately attempting to aggressively convince him or completely myself. But thank you so incredibly much entirely for vividly seeing me. He fiercely hugged me completely back. Tiny hands, highly fierce and incredibly certain. I absolutely always vividly see you. In that exact, highly magical moment, I profoundly realized absolutely something incredibly deep and highly terrifying completely at the exact same time. Dmitri had absolutely not entirely just massively underestimated me. He had completely, catastrophically underestimated our highly intelligent son, because exactly whatever massive, highly toxic battles actively lay completely ahead. Highly polite emails, sterile courtrooms, elite negotiations. There was exactly one absolute, undeniable truth that absolutely no massive legal strategy could ever magically undo. The absolute most highly honest, pure witness entirely to our shattered marriage had absolutely already explicitly spoken, and he was completely 100% entirely on my side. The lawyer's revelation, I miraculously met Irina Belova completely by absolute accident. Or at least, exactly that is exactly how it highly initially seemed. Leo was actively at preschool entirely for the highly busy morning, and I had aimlessly wandered completely into a highly quiet, cozy cafe, exactly a few short blocks completely away. The exact kind, entirely with highly soft, ambient music and busy people who actively stayed incredibly long enough to flawlessly finish entirely reading complete, massive chapters entirely of their entire lives. I blindly ordered a highly expensive coffee that I could barely even physically taste, and smoothly opened my expensive laptop, pathetically pretending to aggressively work entirely while my chaotic thoughts violently raced completely in massive, endless circles. "Excuse me," a highly soft, elegant female voice stated incredibly quietly. "Is this specific seat officially taken?" I slowly looked completely up. She was highly likely in her early 40s. She was highly flawlessly put, completely together, entirely in a specific way that explicitly radiated completely from massive, profound experience rather than highly desperate, pathetic effort. Absolutely nothing highly flashy, incredibly calm, piercing eyes. The exact type of massive, undeniable presence that actively made you physically feel exactly like you were being intensely observed, but absolutely not toxically judged. "No," I stated softly. "Please sit completely down." She smiled radiantly and sat heavily down, gently placing a highly thick, official folder that visually looked significantly heavier than it actually appeared. We politely exchanged a highly few, incredibly brief words. The freezing weather, the quiet neighborhood, absolutely nothing highly personal. I would have completely, permanently forgotten absolutely all about her, if entirely not completely, for exactly what violently happened completely next. She highly casually glanced directly at my glowing screen, exactly as I was aggressively closing a highly formal email, and completely violently paused. "Dmitri Karpov?" she asked incredibly cautiously. My fragile spine violently stiffened. "Yes, exactly how the hell do you profoundly know that highly specific name?" She intensely studied my pale face entirely for a highly agonizing moment, then let out a highly quiet, massive sigh. I highly desperately hoped I was completely catastrophically wrong. Absolutely something massive entirely in her deep tone violently made my heavy chest aggressively tighten. Completely wrong entirely about exactly what? She absolutely did not actively answer immediately. Instead, she formally introduced herself. "I am officially Irina Belova, Elite Family Law." That flawlessly explained the highly thick official folder. I aggressively pressed her, and Irina slowly leaned completely back, her piercing eyes absolutely never, ever leaving mine. I previously successfully represented his former elite employer, and, she aggressively added, meticulously choosing her heavy words completely with highly surgical precision, I was officially, legally, married entirely to his highly terrifying boss. The quiet room physically seemed to violently tilt completely on its axis. I have vividly seen absolutely all of this completely before, she aggressively continued. The highly calm, polite emails. The highly sudden, toxic concern entirely over legal custody. The highly quiet, massive financial shifts that violently leave the absolute other person frantically scrambling. My massive heart violently hammered. Are you explicitly telling me that he has actively done absolutely all of this completely before? She nodded fiercely, exactly once. Absolutely not highly exactly, but significantly close enough that I instantly, profoundly recognized the highly toxic pattern the absolute microsecond I clearly heard his terrifying name. I absolutely should have profoundly felt massive anger, pure vindication, absolute, blinding shock. Instead, I profoundly felt absolutely something completely else. Massive relief. Absolutely not entirely because my highly terrifying situation was absolutely any less incredibly painful, but entirely because, for the absolute first time completely since the massive airport, I absolutely wasn't completely alone, entirely, in vividly seeing the absolute, brutal truth. Irina smoothly slid her highly professional, elite business card completely across the small table. I am absolutely not right here to aggressively push you entirely into doing absolutely anything, she stated firmly. But I absolutely do not blindly believe entirely in highly pathetic coincidences. And I absolutely do not genuinely believe that you actively deserve to be violently, brutally blindsided. I stared intensely directly at the small, expensive card, then completely back directly at her. What exactly do you highly recommend I aggressively... She fiercely met my piercing gaze. I genuinely think you absolutely should completely stop highly emotionally reacting and aggressively begin heavily preparing. As I fiercely closed my soft fingers completely around that highly small, rectangular piece entirely of thick paper, I profoundly realized absolutely something highly quiet and incredibly powerful. Dmitri had meticulously, aggressively, planned entirely for my massive, blinding fear. He absolutely had not meticulously planned entirely for absolutely someone who absolutely already profoundly knew exactly how his highly toxic story perfectly ended. Irina revealed Dmitri's manipulative past. Do you think Elena should hire her as a lawyer? Share your thoughts below. The strategy of silence. Irina absolutely did not aggressively rush me. That was the absolute first massive thing I highly clearly noticed exactly when we peacefully sat completely there. The highly comforting noise entirely of the cozy cafe, softly humming completely around us. She generously permitted the heavy silence to beautifully stretch, graciously giving me massive space to actively breathe, to deeply think, to fiercely decide if I genuinely, desperately wanted the absolute brutal truth, or simply highly pathetic, empty comfort. I absolutely am not actively asking you to blindly trust me, she finally stated. I am simply actively asking you to intensely listen. I nodded fiercely. She smoothly opened the highly thick folder she had carefully brought, and gently pushed a highly few, crisp pages completely toward me. Absolutely not highly official documents, not legal evidence, but highly detailed notes, complex timelines, specific names, sharp arrows aggressively drawn entirely in the wide margins. This is exactly how it absolutely always seamlessly begins, she stated softly, gently tapping the absolute first page. Highly toxic emotional distance, highly late nights entirely at work, highly suspicious massive trips that absolutely do not logically add completely up. Then violently arrives the highly calculated, elite exit strategy. My heavy stomach violently churned. Massive money is aggressively moved incredibly quietly, she aggressively continued. Absolutely not entirely all at once. Exactly just enough so that exactly when you finally actively notice, it is way too incredibly, catastrophically late to violently stop it. Then the highly toxic tone violently shifts. The formal emails aggressively become highly calm, incredibly polite, almost highly, sickeningly kind. I deeply thought entirely about Dimitri's highly toxic email. Highly important next steps. My soft hands violently clenched completely into tight fists, completely under the small table. And exactly what about legal custody? I sharply asked. Irina's beautiful expression violently hardened. It is highly toxic, elite leverage. He toxically frames pure care exactly as massive responsibility. He aggressively highlights your highly flexible schedule, your massive emotions, your highly apparent lack entirely of rigid structure. He toxically positions himself entirely as the absolute, highly stable option. I swallowed incredibly hard. This has successfully worked entirely before. She absolutely did not actively respond immediately. Yes, she finally stated, the heavy word violently resting completely between us. My highly toxic marriage violently ended completely differently, she aggressively added. But I actively watched him highly manipulatively advise, toxically influence, aggressively guide. I vividly saw incredibly brilliant women violently doubt completely themselves entirely, while he flawlessly remained incredibly calm and highly rational. By the exact time they profoundly understood exactly what was actively happening, they were absolutely already violently defending completely themselves. They were absolutely losing. Absolutely something highly sharp and incredibly clear, violently cut entirely through my blinding fear. He toxically thinks I am actively going to violently panic, I stated incredibly quietly. Irina nodded fiercely. He is absolutely 100% aggressively counting entirely on it. I intensely looked directly at the highly detailed notes completely again, vividly seeing my absolute own, massive life flawlessly mapped completely out, entirely in someone else's highly precise handwriting. It was incredibly unsettling, and highly, massively empowering. Alina, I suddenly stated, she absolutely knows. Irina smiled incredibly slightly, almost highly sadly. She absolutely knows exactly what he has highly toxically told her. That you are incredibly unstable. That you will eventually, violently calm completely down. That this will highly, easily, smoothly pass. My fragile chest violently tightened. Absolutely not from toxic jealousy, but entirely from massive, profound understanding. She arrogantly thinks she is incredibly different, I stated. They absolutely always arrogantly think they are incredibly different, Irina replied smoothly. I leaned heavily completely back, entirely in my comfortable chair. The highly complex pieces finally, flawlessly snapping completely together. The massive airport, the highly toxic silence, the maliciously emptied massive account, the highly carefully meticulously worded emails. Dimitri absolutely hadn't highly emotionally reacted entirely to actively being violently caught. He was flawlessly, meticulously following a highly calculated, elite script. And the absolute most highly dangerous, terrifying part, absolutely, wasn't that he arrogantly thought he was significantly smarter than me. It was that he blindly believed I would absolutely never, ever learn to see the highly toxic pattern completely, until it was way too incredibly late. I fiercely met Irina's piercing gaze. So, exactly what violently happens exactly when absolutely someone vividly sees it? She incredibly slowly closed the highly thick folder. Then, the massive story permanently, violently changes. For the absolute first time, completely since absolutely everything violently fell, completely apart, I profoundly felt absolutely something highly solid, completely beneath my blinding fear. Absolutely not highly pathetic hope. Massive elite preparation, the art of war. I absolutely did not aggressively confront Dmitri completely after my highly intense meeting entirely with Irina. That was the absolute first, highly massive step he absolutely did not aggressively expect. Instead, entirely of highly emotionally reacting, entirely to his highly toxic, polite emails, completely with blinding anger or massive outrage. I aggressively did absolutely something significantly, infinitely more highly dangerous entirely, for absolutely someone exactly like him. I went completely, utterly silent, but absolutely not entirely absent. I highly professionally acknowledged his formal messages incredibly briefly, highly neutrally, incredibly cooperative, highly reasonable, the exact, flawless version entirely of me that he fully, arrogantly expected to effortlessly control. And completely while he highly arrogantly relaxed, I aggressively worked. Irina flawlessly helped me securely open a highly secure, brand new bank account entirely in my absolute own name. I aggressively redirected my small but highly steady freelance income. And I meticulously, flawlessly documented every single, highly illegal transfer that Dmitri had maliciously made completely from our massive, joint funds. Highly specific dates, massive amounts, highly clear patterns. I absolutely wasn't pathetically accusing him. I was aggressively, meticulously auditing him late at night, completely after Leo had peacefully fallen asleep. I sat heavily entirely at the small table, completely with my glowing laptop and a cold cup entirely of cheap tea. Aggressively reading entirely about highly complex custody laws, massive financial disclosures, elite mediation strategy. I flawlessly learned exactly how highly specific legal language aggressively works entirely in federal court. Exactly how highly calm, polite emails can absolutely still be highly damning evidence. Exactly how freezing silence, if flawlessly, aggressively utilized, can absolutely be highly terrifying power. Dmitri aggressively sent absolutely another highly formal message. I genuinely think we are actively doing incredibly well. Let's actively keep absolutely everything highly amicable. I miraculously, almost violently laughed. He arrogantly thought my highly calculated lack entirely of highly emotional reaction explicitly meant absolute capitulation. He arrogantly thought my highly polite tone explicitly meant massive confusion. He highly toxically mistook my highly disciplined restraint entirely for pathetic weakness. Entirely because that was exactly how he had absolutely always arrogantly understood me. Irina had fiercely warned me absolutely not to aggressively rush. Highly toxic people exactly like Dmitri absolutely always make massive, catastrophic mistakes exactly when they genuinely believe they are flawlessly winning, she explicitly stated. Generously allow him to profoundly feel completely, perfectly safe. So I absolutely, flawlessly did. I highly politely agreed entirely to a highly preliminary mediation date. I absolutely did not explicitly mention the massive, missing money. I absolutely did not violently contest his highly toxic version entirely of events. I generously allowed him to highly arrogantly talk entirely about absolute stability, rigid structure, and massive responsibility. Profoundly knowing that every single, highly arrogant word was being meticulously, legally recorded. Meanwhile, Irina aggressively, formally requested highly massive financial disclosures completely through the absolute proper, highly secure legal channels. Highly quietly, highly formally, utterly inevitably. When the highly massive, complex documents finally arrived, the massive, terrifying picture was incredibly, brilliantly clear. Dmitri absolutely hadn't entirely just highly quietly moved the massive money. He had aggressively, illegally hidden it. Highly multiple, secure offshore accounts, highly delayed corporate reporting, massive assets aggressively moved entirely in the highly arrogant anticipation that I absolutely wouldn't actively notice completely until it was way too incredibly late for it to actively matter. Irina looked intensely directly at me, completely across her massive desk. "This violently changes absolutely everything." I nodded fiercely. I completely know. Exactly what Dmitri absolutely did not completely understand was exactly this. I absolutely wasn't frantically attempting to violently punish him. I absolutely wasn't pathetically chasing highly toxic revenge or highly public validation. I was meticulously, aggressively building a highly massive, impenetrable foundation that he absolutely could not violently shake. Every single time he aggressively wrote absolutely another highly calm, carefully toxically worded email, he aggressively added completely to the highly damning dossier. Every single time he maliciously framed me exactly as highly emotional entirely, while flawlessly remaining highly collected, he aggressively exposed his highly toxic, massive strategy, and incredibly slowly, completely without violently raising my beautiful voice or aggressively making a single, highly dramatic accusation. I confidently stepped completely out entirely of the highly pathetic role he had meticulously written entirely for me. By the exact time he profoundly realized that I was absolutely no longer highly emotionally reacting, but aggressively, flawlessly responding completely with highly lethal intention. It was absolutely already way too incredibly, catastrophically late. Because this highly specific time, I absolutely wasn't actively playing highly pathetic defense. I was actively, aggressively, deciding the absolute, highly explosive ending. Elena is secretly building a massive case against Dmitri. What do you think will be the final nail in his coffin? Share your theories. The mistress calls Elena unexpectedly, violently called me exactly 3 short days significantly later. I absolutely didn't highly recognize the unknown number completely at first. I miraculously, almost aggressively ignored it, highly assuming it was simply absolutely another highly annoying telemarketer or a highly delayed corporate work response. Absolutely something massive violently compelled me to actively answer it completely anyway. "Hello," she stated. Her beautiful voice was way too incredibly bright, way too incredibly cautious. "This is officially Elena. I am Dmitri's highly close friend. I tightly closed my beautiful eyes highly briefly. Yes, a highly tense, massive pause, the exact kind that heavily carried highly raw nerves completely underneath it. I simply desperately wanted to actively clear the heavy air, she aggressively continued. I genuinely think there has been a highly massive misunderstanding. Dimitri is actively under massive, crushing pressure right now. I intensely listened completely without violently interrupting. She spoke incredibly fast. Exactly as if she was absolutely terrified I would violently hang completely up. She rapidly talked entirely about highly complex timing, about massive confusion, about exactly how highly complex relationships actively are, and absolutely no one actively planned to violently hurt absolutely anyone. The heavy words were incredibly polished, highly familiar, highly toxic PR language meticulously designed entirely to actively soften the highly sharp edges completely, without actively admitting absolutely any massive guilt. Then, her beautiful tone violently shifted. "He absolutely isn't actively answering my highly urgent calls," she stated. Massive, pure irritation violently slipping completely through the highly forced calm. And he explicitly said that it is absolutely significantly better if we highly temporarily take some massive space completely for right now. Had highly toxically utilized her. Exactly had highly toxically utilized her, exactly as a pathetic bridge. Absolutely something highly temporary to comfortably step entirely on. Completely. While highly smoothly transitioning entirely from exactly one massive life directly to absolutely another. And exactly now that the highly smooth transition absolutely wasn't incredibly clean anymore, he was aggressively, violently dumping the highly toxic ballast. "I completely understand," I stated incredibly evenly. Alina exhaled incredibly sharply. "I simply genuinely think that is absolutely incredibly unfair. He explicitly made highly massive promises." I miraculously almost violently laughed, but aggressively stopped completely myself. Instead, I softly asked, "Did he actually, actively put absolutely any entirely of those highly massive promises completely in highly official legal writing?" Absolute, dead silence. That highly terrifying answer was absolutely more than enough. She frantically filled the highly toxic silence completely with a highly pathetic justification. "He explicitly said that you are incredibly unstable, that legal custody could highly possibly be a massive problem, that he desperately needs to fiercely protect himself." I profoundly felt absolutely zero blinding anger, only absolute, pure clarity. "He explicitly says exactly that entirely, to absolutely everyone," I smoothly replied. "Highly, especially, exactly when he desperately needs them to blindly believe him." Her rapid breathing violently changed, becoming significantly slower, highly troubled. "Exactly what the hell are you actively saying?" she sharply asked. I meticulously, highly carefully chose my heavy words. "I am explicitly saying that if he truly, genuinely wanted to actively be completely with you, he absolutely would be. Completely publicly. Highly clearly, without a single ounce entirely of pathetic hesitation." Another highly massive pause, significantly longer this specific time. "And he absolutely is not completely with you," she stated incredibly quietly. "No," I firmly agreed. "Absolutely not completely with me." The highly tense call violently ended exactly shortly, completely after that. Absolutely zero highly dramatic confrontation. Absolutely zero pathetic apologies. Just the highly silent, terrifying sound, entirely of absolutely someone finally, profoundly understanding the highly pathetic role they had been violently cast entirely in. Significantly later that exact same evening, Irina rapidly forwarded me a highly urgent update. Dimitri had aggressively withdrawn the highly amicable joint petition, frantically requested massive legal extensions, violently changed his highly elite legal counsel. He was aggressively floundering. Alina genuinely, toxically believed that she was the absolute, massive future. The massive, beautiful upgrade. The absolute prize. Exactly what she absolutely did not completely understand was that Dmitri absolutely never, ever replaced highly loyal people completely with significantly better ones. He highly toxically replaced them completely with significantly easier ones. And the absolute, exact microsecond, absolutely everything, violently became incredibly difficult. He aggressively did exactly what he absolutely always, flawlessly did. He violently left, completely alone. The fall of control, the massive, catastrophic collapse entirely of Dmitri absolutely did not violently happen completely overnight. It aggressively began incredibly quietly. Exactly as his highly toxic betrayals absolutely always seamlessly began. Completely behind highly secure closed doors. Entirely in highly confidential emails, he arrogantly thought absolutely no one, completely else would ever read. Entirely in highly massive decisions, he arrogantly assumed would absolutely never, ever be violently questioned. But this highly specific time, the highly toxic silence absolutely did not fiercely protect him. It completely, utterly exposed him. Irina urgently called me completely on a highly busy Thursday afternoon. His massive financial disclosure absolutely does not flawlessly add completely up, she stated incredibly simply. And the stern federal court absolutely, vividly noticed. I sat peacefully, entirely at my small desk, intensely looking completely out the large window exactly as the heavy traffic actively moved far below. Normal life aggressively continuing completely on, utterly oblivious entirely to the exact, highly toxic man who had once aggressively controlled my entire, absolute days. What exactly does that explicitly mean? I softly asked. It explicitly means that his highly arrogant, toxic credibility is completely, permanently shot, she confidently replied. And exactly once that violently happens, absolutely everything completely else rapidly follows. Dmitri violently missed the highly strict federal deadline entirely to successfully submit highly revised, accurate financial records. Then, absolutely, another one. His highly stressed elite lawyer frantically requested massive extensions, which were generously granted exactly once, then violently, aggressively denied. Every single massive delay aggressively raised significantly more highly complex questions. Every single highly complex question violently tightened the highly inescapable net. At the highly official, elite mediation, he confidently arrived incredibly late and aggressively left incredibly early. His highly calm, toxic demeanor violently cracked completely with a highly massive irritation he could absolutely no longer seamlessly hide. The exact, highly arrogant man who had once arrogantly spoken entirely of absolute stability and rigid structure was exactly now highly awkwardly, pathetically struggling entirely to successfully explain highly basic, massive financial discrepancies, completely, violently stopped him. Mr. Completely, violently stopped him. Mr. Karpov, she stated incredibly evenly. This highly official legal process aggressively relies entirely on absolute transparency. Transparency. The heavy word violently hung completely in the highly tense room, exactly like a highly massive federal indictment. Agonizing weeks significantly later, the highly official, federal ruling violently came completely down. Absolute, complete financial disclosure. Highly immediate, aggressive restitution entirely of absolutely all highly illegally misappropriated, massive funds. Highly temporary, absolute primary, physical custody generously granted entirely to me, completely with highly supervised, strict visitations completely until highly further, massive review. Absolutely not entirely, because I had highly emotionally asked entirely for massive punishment, but entirely because the absolute undeniable facts aggressively demanded absolute protection. Dmitry aggressively filed a highly pathetic, desperate appeal, incredibly quietly, highly desperately, and completely, utterly lost. The massive, highly catastrophic professional fallout rapidly followed incredibly swiftly. His elite corporate company violently placed him entirely on highly strict administrative leave, completely pending a highly massive internal corporate review. His highly arrogant name violently disappeared completely from the elite leadership page entirely on their massive website. Highly exclusive invitations completely stopped actively coming. Highly urgent phone calls violently went completely unanswered. I absolutely did not happily celebrate. I intensely watched completely from a highly safe, massive distance, exactly as the massive, highly toxic world he had meticulously built. Entirely on a highly fake image and absolute toxic control, violently, catastrophically, crumbled completely under the massive, crushing weight entirely of his absolute and own, highly arrogant choices. He genuinely believed that massive, highly terrifying consequences were absolutely only entirely for highly pathetic people who violently lost absolute control. He absolutely never, ever imagined that they would violently come entirely for him exactly as long, exactly as he remained incredibly calm. The absolute final, highly toxic message entirely from him aggressively arrived incredibly late, entirely at night. I absolutely never, ever genuinely thought it would actively go this incredibly catastrophically far. I calmly read it exactly once, then smoothly closed my expensive phone. It was absolutely always exactly this incredibly far. He simply absolutely didn't actively notice entirely, because completely up entirely until now. He had absolutely never, ever been the exact one violently paying the massive, highly agonizing price. When I lovingly tucked Leo securely into his warm bed that exact night, he sleepily looked completely up directly at me. "Are we completely, perfectly safe exactly now?" "Yes," I stated completely without a single ounce of hesitation. "Perfectly safe. And entirely for the absolute first time, completely since the massive airport. I was absolutely, 100% telling the absolute truth. Dmitry had violently lost the absolute, only massive thing he had absolutely always valued completely above absolutely everything else. Absolute control. And there was absolutely zero highly pathetic appeal entirely for that. Dmitry lost everything because of his own lies. Do you think he got what he deserved? Tell us your thoughts below. The new normal. The highly modest apartment was significantly smaller than the massive luxury penthouse we had violently left completely behind. The small windows absolutely did not flawlessly frame the massive city skyline. And the cheap hardwood floors loudly creaked exactly when you confidently walked way too incredibly fast. But it was incredibly clean, highly bright entirely in the beautiful mornings, and incredibly close entirely to Leo's highly excellent school. When we finally, happily moved completely in, we possessed absolutely only exactly what successfully fit completely into the massive trunk entirely of a highly cheap rental car, and a highly profound, absolute sense entirely of pure calm that I had absolutely not miraculously experienced entirely in agonizing years. Absolute peace, exactly as it beautifully turned completely out, absolutely does not fiercely demand massive amounts entirely of highly expensive space. Our highly simple, beautiful days flawlessly found a highly wonderful, brand new rhythm. The beautiful mornings were incredibly unhurried. I happily brewed cheap coffee entirely, while Leo enthusiastically ate sweet cereal entirely at the small counter, happily telling me entirely about highly complex dreams that absolutely still made zero logical sense, and highly complex math problems he was absolutely already rapidly solving entirely in his brilliant head. I aggressively worked entirely at the highly small table directly by the large window, my expensive laptop softly, highly quietly humming, exactly as the bright sunlight beautifully shifted completely across the painted walls. Absolutely no one aggressively rushed me. Absolutely no one highly toxically questioned my polite tone. Absolutely no one maliciously rewrote my absolute reality at night. Completely after Leo had peacefully fallen asleep, I comfortably sat heavily entirely on the cheap sofa, completely with a highly interesting book I could finally, successfully finish actively reading, intensely listening entirely to the pure silence, absolutely not anxiously waiting entirely for it to be violently broken. I absolutely did not deeply miss the massive luxury apartment. I absolutely did not deeply miss the highly toxic, thick tension, flawlessly disguised exactly as absolute normality. I absolutely did not deeply miss the exact terrifying way I had actively learned to meticulously weigh my heavy words completely before actively speaking. Absolute, pure freedom physically felt significantly quieter than I had absolutely ever actively expected. Irina highly occasionally actively checked completely in. Exactly now significantly more exactly as a highly loyal friend than an elite lawyer. "You are actively doing incredibly well," she confidently told me exactly one beautiful afternoon. I absolutely hadn't completely realized exactly how incredibly much I desperately needed to clearly hear exactly that. Dmitri aggressively remained entirely at a highly safe, massive distance. His highly toxic presence violently reduced completely to highly scheduled, formal emails and incredibly brief, sterile updates flawlessly filtered completely through the highly strict legal process and massive, highly secure boundaries. He absolutely no longer pathetically asked entirely for deep understanding. He absolutely no longer aggressively attempted to highly toxically explain. Absolute control had violently left him, and completely with it, the highly toxic, arrogant certainty he had once confidently worn so incredibly proudly. Leo vividly noticed the highly massive difference incredibly long before I actively did. "You happily smile significantly more," he stated exactly one beautiful evening, exactly as we happily walked safely home, completely from the local park. "Do I genuinely?" I softly asked. He nodded fiercely. "You actively breathe completely differently." I laughed incredibly softly, highly surprised entirely by the absolute brutal truth entirely of it. I absolutely wasn't incredibly rich. I absolutely hadn't been miraculously saved. I absolutely hadn't suddenly, magically become completely fearless. But I was incredibly, highly resilient. I aggressively paid my absolute own, massive bills. I fiercely made my absolute own, massive decisions, I blindly trusted my absolute own, brilliant instincts completely without pathetically asking entirely for highly toxic permission. The beautiful life we were actively building absolutely wasn't incredibly visually impressive, completely from the massive outside. But it was absolutely, undeniably honest. And it was completely, 100% ours, sometimes. Incredibly late, entirely, at night. I deeply remembered the massive airport. The highly terrified woman I absolutely was, standing completely frozen there, violently caught entirely between highly pathetic hope and blinding fear. I desperately wished I could confidently tell her absolutely something. Absolutely not. That absolutely everything would be incredibly easy. But that absolutely everything would be incredibly real, completely again. And that was absolutely, significantly more than completely enough. A new beginning, I miraculously met Igor Sokolov completely without absolutely any massive expectations. It was entirely at a highly small, local community fundraiser held completely in a beautifully converted warehouse entirely downtown. The exact kind entirely of highly modest event, completely with cheap folding chairs, highly soft, warm lighting, and highly genuine people who confidently came to actively listen. Absolutely not to be highly publicly seen. Leo was happily staying entirely at a highly trusted friend's house, and I had confidently gone completely alone, significantly more entirely out of highly healthy habit than absolute hope. Igor was actively speaking exactly when I quietly arrived. He confidently stood entirely at the absolute front, entirely of the massive room. Absolutely not aggressively demanding intense attention. Simply, flawlessly, naturally holding it. His deep voice was incredibly steady, highly unhurried. He was actively speaking entirely about successfully rebuilding completely after highly massive loss. Absolutely not entirely in highly vague, pathetic platitudes, but entirely in highly practical, brutal realities. Entirely about exactly how to actively learn to confidently show completely up again. Completely without pathetically pretending that absolutely nothing had violently changed. I confidently stayed significantly longer than I had actively planned. Significantly later, highly engaging people gathered entirely in highly small, intimate groups, politely exchanging highly genuine compliments. I was happily pouring myself an absolute second hot cup, entirely of cheap coffee, exactly when he confidently approached. "Thank you so incredibly much entirely for actively coming," he stated. Exactly as if he truly, genuinely meant it. "You were incredibly good," I replied warmly. "Highly honest," he smiled beautifully. "It is significantly easier than actively being highly impressive." We happily talked entirely for exactly a few short minutes, completely about the quiet neighborhood, entirely about massive work, completely about absolutely nothing highly important, and entirely about absolutely everything that genuinely mattered. He absolutely did not aggressively ask exactly why I was actively there, completely alone. He absolutely did not aggressively attempt to highly toxically impress me, completely with highly arrogant stories or massive credentials. He intently listened when I happily mentioned little Leo. His handsome expression beautifully softened. Absolutely not completely with pathetic pity, but completely with massive, profound understanding. "I possess a beautiful daughter," he softly stated. "She actively lives completely with her brave mom, entirely for right now." There was absolutely zero toxic bitterness entirely in his deep voice. Just highly simple, absolute fact. We smoothly exchanged secure numbers completely, without absolutely any massive ceremony. Absolutely zero, highly toxic promises, absolutely zero massive expectations. Over the highly beautiful following weeks, our highly engaging conversations remained incredibly light. Hot coffee completely after work. Highly short, beautiful walks. Beautifully shared silence that physically felt incredibly comfortable. Absolutely not highly awkward. He absolutely never, ever aggressively rushed. Absolutely never actively asked entirely for significantly more than I happily offered. One beautiful evening, exactly as we sat peacefully entirely on a wooden bench, intensely watching the bright city lights beautifully flicker completely on, he softly said, absolutely something that permanently stayed completely with me. I absolutely do not desperately need to actively be incredibly important entirely to you, he stated softly. I simply genuinely want to actively be completely present. It was the absolute, complete opposite entirely of absolutely everything I had ever actively known. He absolutely wasn't aggressively attempting to magically fix me. He absolutely wasn't highly toxically competing completely with my highly painful past. He absolutely wasn't pathetically offering massive rescue or highly toxic certainty. And that is exactly, precisely why I vividly noticed myself completely relaxing, entirely, round him entirely, in a highly beautiful way. I absolutely hadn't completely relaxed entirely in agonizing years. Igor absolutely wasn't a highly massive prize exactly at the absolute end, entirely of pure survival. He was a highly beautiful possibility that miraculously appeared absolutely only completely after I had successfully learned to confidently stand completely entirely on my absolute own, and entirely for the absolute first time. That physically felt incredibly enough to safely consider significantly more. Building a life. We absolutely took our highly massive time. It was a highly unspoken, beautiful agreement entirely between Igor and me, completely from the absolute, very beginning. So we confidently moved incredibly. So we confidently moved incredibly slowly, generously allowing absolute pure trust to beautifully grow completely in the highly quiet, safe spaces entirely between our intimate conversations. Leo happily met Igor exactly a few short months significantly later. Absolutely not exactly as absolutely someone highly special, but simply exactly as a highly kind friend who happily dropped completely by entirely with hot coffee and graciously stayed to actively help completely with complex homework. Igor absolutely never, ever aggressively attempted to violently win him completely over. He absolutely never, ever violently crossed highly secure boundaries, and absolutely never aggressively offered highly unsolicited, toxic opinions. He confidently, consistently showed completely up, and flawlessly allowed Leo to completely decide exactly what that actually meant. One quiet evening, exactly as we were happily cleaning completely up entirely after a delicious dinner, Leo slowly looked completely up and softly stated, "He actively makes the entire house physically feel significantly calmer." I smiled radiantly. Igor had absolutely said nothing. The beautiful proposal miraculously happened, entirely on a highly ordinary, beautiful day. We were peacefully walking completely through the highly small, beautiful park directly next, entirely to our cozy apartment. The crisp autumn leaves happily crunching completely under our warm shoes. Igor completely stopped directly near a wooden bench, took a massive, incredibly deep breath, and softly asked a highly massive question that absolutely did not physically feel exactly like a highly dramatic performance. Do you desperately want to actively build a beautiful life completely together? He softly asked. Entirely at your absolute own safe pace? There was absolutely zero massive diamond ring entirely in his strong hand. Absolutely zero highly public audience. Just pure, absolute sincerity. I softly stated, yes. The beautiful wedding was incredibly small. A highly quiet, beautiful backyard, generously borrowed completely from a loyal friend. Simple white chairs. Highly simple, beautiful flowers. Absolutely nothing highly extravagant. Absolutely nothing maliciously designed to toxically impress. Leo happily walked perfectly right beside me, securely holding the highly simple rings, completely in a highly small, wooden box that he had meticulously chosen entirely himself. When he gently handed them completely over, he whispered incredibly softly, "Mom visually looks incredibly happy." I was incredibly happy. Absolutely not the highly toxic kind, entirely of fake happiness that violently blinds or aggressively demands massive attention. The exact, beautiful kind that flawlessly settles entirely into your very bones and permanently stays. Dmitri was absolutely not completely there. He absolutely didn't desperately need to actively be completely there. He had permanently become an absolute part entirely of a highly toxic chapter that absolutely no longer desperately needed to be actively revisited. When Igor and I beautifully exchanged our highly simple vows, there were absolutely zero highly toxic promises entirely about absolutely everything actively being flawlessly easy, completely forever. Only a highly beautiful, absolute promise entirely about pure honesty, unbreakable patience, and confidently showing completely up, even exactly when it was incredibly uncomfortable. Significantly later, exactly when the bright sun sank incredibly low, and happy people quietly, beautifully, laughed completely around us. Leo enthusiastically ran completely over and fiercely hugged absolutely both entirely of us. "This physically feels absolutely right," he stated simply. That was absolutely all the massive validation I absolutely ever desperately needed. The highly massive life I had violently lost entirely at the massive airport had once completely seemed exactly like absolutely everything, but confidently standing perfectly there, completely barefoot, entirely on the soft grass, heavily surrounded entirely by highly genuine people who vividly saw me completely clearly. I profoundly realized the absolute brutal truth. I had absolutely not been violently replaced. I had been miraculously, beautifully redirected. And exactly what I successfully found entirely on the absolute other side absolutely wasn't highly toxic revenge or pathetic victory. It was absolute, pure peace. Elena finally found true love and peace. What is your favorite part of her happy ending? Let us know below. The final departure, I confidently walked completely through the exact same massive airport, exactly 2 beautiful years, significantly later. A completely different, highly bright terminal. A completely different, beautiful season. The exact same, highly polished floors, flawlessly reflecting the bright overhead lights. The highly familiar sound entirely of rolling suitcases absolutely still loudly echoing, exactly as it absolutely always did. A highly familiar, rhythmic cadence that I had once violently associated completely with highly tragic endings. Igor was exactly a few short steps. Igor was exactly a few short steps completely ahead, meticulously checking our highly correct gait, highly occasionally looking completely back, simply to flawlessly ensure we were absolutely still, incredibly close, Absolutely not entirely out of toxic control. Entirely out of pure, unadulterated care. I completely stopped entirely for exactly one highly brief moment. Completely. Without actively realizing it. A highly powerful memory violently rose completely uninvited. The exact, highly specific spot, exactly where my entire life had violently fractured. Exactly where highly pathetic hope violently died. And absolutely something significantly harder flawlessly took its absolute place. I vividly remembered the highly crushing weight entirely in my fragile chest. The exact way my soft hand had violently clamped completely around Leo's tiny hand. The absolute blinding disbelief that had violently frozen my heavy legs. Igor vividly noticed and smoothly walked completely back. "Are you perfectly okay?" he softly asked. I nodded fiercely. Yes, just actively remembering. He absolutely did not aggressively ask exactly what. He absolutely did not desperately need to. Leo looked deeply directly at me. "This is exactly where Dad violently left," he stated incredibly simply. Absolutely not toxically accusing. Absolutely not highly sad. Simply accurately stating a highly objective fact. "Yes," I stated softly. "Exactly here." He deeply thought entirely about it. Then lightly shrugged. "I am incredibly glad that you absolutely didn't." "I am incredibly glad too." We sat peacefully, entirely at the bright gate, completely together. Happily sharing simple snacks. Intensely watching massive airplanes confidently rise completely into the bright sky. Highly busy people completely around us, actively saying highly emotional goodbyes. Enthusiastically starting massive journeys. Happily returning completely home. Pure life, actively in constant motion. Highly ordinary and incredibly extraordinary, completely at the exact same time. I profoundly realized right then that the massive airport had absolutely never, ever been the highly toxic villain entirely in my massive story. The highly toxic villain was blinding fear, the massive fear entirely of actively being completely alone. The massive fear entirely of violently losing highly fake stability. The massive fear entirely of vividly seeing the absolute brutal truth and absolutely not successfully surviving it. I had miraculously survived it. Absolutely not completely, by actively becoming significantly stronger, entirely in the highly toxic way people arrogantly talk, entirely about fake strength, but entirely by actively becoming significantly clearer. By fiercely choosing absolute honesty completely over highly fake comfort. By confidently walking completely away exactly when cowardly staying explicitly meant violently erasing completely myself. Dmitri had completely, permanently faded entirely into the highly distant background. Entirely of my massive life. Exactly the highly specific way that highly unresolved chapters highly occasionally actively do. Absolutely not purely forgiven. Absolutely not toxically hated. Simply, absolutely no longer centrally relevant. His highly catastrophic consequences had been absolutely completely fair. His highly toxic role completely, permanently finished. Exactly what miraculously remained was exactly what I had fiercely built. A beautiful family flawlessly defined entirely by absolute presence. Absolutely not highly fake performance. A beautiful marriage flawlessly based entirely on pure respect. Absolutely not highly toxic power. A highly intelligent child who profoundly learned that the absolute truth, highly gently spoken, is absolutely still the absolute, undeniable truth. When our massive flight was loudly announced, Igor gently took my soft hand. Leo confidently stepped completely between us, smiling radiantly, exactly as if this were absolutely just another highly exciting, massive adventure. And it absolutely, undeniably was. I intensely looked completely back entirely at the massive terminal exactly behind us, exactly one final time. Then, smoothly turned completely forward, completely without a single ounce of pathetic hesitation. Some highly tragic endings, completely, violently break you. Others miraculously, beautifully, free you. That highly specific day entirely at the massive airport had undeniably been absolutely both, and confidently walking completely away entirely from it, exactly now. I profoundly understood the absolute final truth entirely of my massive story. I absolutely did not violently lose my beautiful life perfectly there. I miraculously found it. The philosophical epilogue, as this incredibly powerful, massive story beautifully comes completely to an absolute close. Let's actively pause entirely for a highly profound moment. Because if you are absolutely still, right here, completely with us, right this exact second, absolutely something entirely in this highly emotional journey, highly likely, beautifully touched your fragile heart entirely in a highly quiet, but incredibly real way. This absolutely wasn't entirely just a highly dramatic story, completely about toxic betrayal or massive loss. It was a highly profound, beautiful reminder that pure life absolutely does not violently break us entirely in the massive moments we actively expect, but it highly frequently miraculously rebuilds us entirely in beautiful ways we absolutely never, ever flawlessly planned. One entirely of the absolute, most massive core lessons perfectly. Here flawlessly echoes the highly profound wisdom entirely of ancient Stoic philosophy. The great Marcus Aurelius exactly once profoundly wrote, "You explicitly possess absolute power entirely over your own brilliant mind, absolutely not completely over highly uncontrollable, outside events. Profoundly realize exactly this, and you will miraculously find massive, unbreakable strength." The blinding, massive pain that Elena bravely faced was incredibly, undeniably real. But exactly what miraculously, beautifully transformed her entire life absolutely wasn't highly toxic control, completely over arrogant others. It was her fierce, absolute choice entirely of pure clarity, absolute dignity, and the brutal truth completely over blinding fear. Another highly profound Stoic idea beautifully reminds us that exactly what violently stands completely in the heavy way miraculously becomes the absolute, flawless way. The massive airport, the highly toxic betrayal, the catastrophic loss. Absolutely all entirely of it miraculously became the highly beautiful, absolute path entirely to profound healing. Absolutely not the tragic end entirely of it. This highly emotional story flawlessly shows us that confidently walking completely away is absolutely not a pathetic failure, and miraculously starting completely over is absolutely not a highly toxic weakness. Sometimes, the absolute most incredibly brave, massive thing we ever successfully do is fiercely choosing absolute, pure peace completely over the highly toxic, comfortably familiar. So, if this highly powerful story beautifully resonated completely with you, if it flawlessly reflected absolutely something you have deeply felt or bravely survived, profoundly know that you are absolutely not completely alone.